As people trickle in, I'll share my screen. We'll get started in a few minutes while we let everyone join in from the new link.
Mm-hmm.
We'll wait for a few more people and then we'll get started. Okay, I'm so glad you all found the new link. I'm so sorry about those technical difficulties, but thank you all for joining us today. I'm Dahlia. I'm the IPF Atid Strategic Initiatives Associate here at Israel Policy Forum. IPF Atid is the Young Professionals Network of Israel Policy Forum, a nonpartisan organization dedicated to advancing support for a viable two-state solution consistent with Israel's security. We have an exciting program today. We are joined by IPF Atid's own Karen Poreh, who will lead the conversation with our two wonderful experts speakers to discuss how expanding Israel's regional integration can be a part of laying the groundwork for two states. Today's conversation is the third of a new series we're hosting to roll out Israel Policy Forum's new integrated policy approach called A Realistic Reset. Before I turn it over to Karen, our moderator, I'll share a quick video that gives a brief overview of the Realistic Reset policy approach. Give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen.
When it comes to U.S. policy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's time for a realistic reset. There are no quick fixes, especially after the previous administration upended decades of bipartisan consensus on the conflict.
So I'm looking at two-state and one-state.
They released a plan that envisioned Israeli annexation of large parts of the West Bank and cut off all aid to the Palestinians. Now, this is the moment for a focused policy agenda that achieves near-term stability for both Israelis and the Palestinians, advances the interests of both sides, and lays the groundwork for achieving a sustainable two-state outcome. Our agenda has 4 areas of focus: strengthening the U.S.-Israel relationship and Israel's security, rebuilding U.S.-Palestinian ties, expanding Israel's regional integration based on the Abraham Accords, and restoring a political horizon for a two-state outcome. To learn more about a realistic reset, visit israelpolicyforum.org/realistic reset.
So this webinar will be recorded and posted online for further sharing. We encourage you to tweet using the hashtag realistic reset. And now I'll turn it over to Karen Poreh, a Charles Bronfman convener and today's moderator.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank you, Dahlia, for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. And thank you to our panelists for taking the time. My name is Karen Poreh. As Dahlia said, I'm a 2018 Charles Bronfman convener at IPF. And during the day, I'm a vice president at Albright Stonebridge Group, a strategic advisory and commercial diplomacy firm where I help companies do business in emerging markets. We're excited to have this conversation today about Israel's regional integration with about 80 young professionals across the country. We want this conversation to be interactive, and so we will get to the audience questions throughout the conversation and certainly at the end. In the meantime, please do send us questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll also be polling the audience so we can get some of your thoughts shared with us throughout the conversation. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Dr. Shira Efron is a policy advisor at IPF. In parallel, she is a visiting fellow at the INSS in Tel Aviv and a special advisor on Israel with the RAND Corporation. Before joining INSS and Iran, Dr. Efron was a Middle East analyst at several think tanks in Washington, D.C., including the Center for American Progress and the Middle East Institute. She is a member of the board of directors of Forum Devora, which promotes women in the security establishment. Hussein Ibish is a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. He's a weekly columnist for Bloomberg and the National UAE, and is also a regular contributor to many other US and Middle Eastern publications. He has made thousands of radio and television appearances and was the Washington, D.C. correspondent for the Daily Star. Ibish previously served as a senior fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine and executive director of the Hala Salam Maqsood Foundation for Arab American Leadership. Thank you both for joining us today.
Well, it's great to be with you.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Dalia.
Thank you both. So I'd like to kick off the conversation with some questions. The first question will be for Shira and then Hussein. In the second half of 2020, Israel made significant diplomatic inroads in the Arab world as it established official ties with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. How can these new relations between Israel and the Arab nations be leveraged to promote Israeli-Palestinian peace? Shira, over to you.
So again, thank you, Karen, for this question. It's really good to be with all of you here, and especially with Hussein, who I really look forward to hearing what he has to say about this question. I think there's probably like the optimistic version, which I'll give first, and then maybe we can dive into the skepticism. So first of all, what you described, those normalizing ties, the inroads that Israel made, it's really a major diplomatic achievement, but I would characterize it as something that was done not really between Israel and those countries, but rather between the US and those countries. Don't get me wrong, I'm all pro normalization. I think it's what the Middle East needs more and more, but there was definitely like a transactional nature behind these agreements and the timing that they happened. We could say this was a work in progress, it was only a matter of time, but the Trump administration, with offering sweeteners, though those four countries would not have received otherwise, definitely expedited the process. But it doesn't matter, because still there's a positive reality, and we can probably use these normalizing, the normalization process to try to re-energize, should say, the Israeli-Palestinian process. And I think initially the Palestinian response to the normalization agreements was negative, not to all of them at the same degree, but we can talk about that. And Israel was, of course, excited and said, well, you see, now we normalize ties without making any progress on the Palestinian front, so we can say, oh, we don't need the Palestinians anymore. But I think now, a few months later, everyone on both sides basically understand that no matter what happens in the larger region, those people still are stuck here in the same small piece of land, and they have to find a solution working together. So what does it mean? I guess, and we can speak about it, more in detail, but I guess what you can try to do is use different economic, political, diplomatic incentives with the already normalizing ties. So you had United Arab Emirates, the Bahrainis, Sudan, and put aside for a second, but Morocco is a very important country, and the old ones, Egypt and Jordan, bring them in to try to create, to energize both sides and create incentives for both Israelis and Palestinians to move constructively toward, let's say, some sort of a peaceful process that would lead one day, hopefully, to a resolution, but also try to bring in new other countries. That country, the crown jewel, the one that we would call, would be Saudi Arabia. If you can build on the model of the Israeli-UAE normalization, which included Israeli suspension of West Bank annexation, it's been less than a year, but a few months ago, we all basically, I think, depending on which side you were on, but we all feared that Israel was going to annex territory in the West Bank and make a two-state solution even less viable than we hope to maintain it, right? But it's really in a precarious situation. Maybe for normalization with Israel, with Saudi, which Israel would seek most, Israel would agree to cease settlement activity or recommit to a two-state solution, which it hasn't done, and Benjamin Netanyahu has not done since 2009. So this is another one. Of course, every time you speak about the Gulf, there is the financial dimension. Can you bring in Arab countries to support economic development, cross-border initiatives between Israelis and Palestinians that would demonstrate success stories? They would not be maybe transformational at the beginning, but they will demonstrate the potential for success. Now, I'll let Hussein chime in with the positive. I just don't know. I think all these things are possible. It would be hard for me to believe that they would just happen organically, because Israelis and Palestinians would decide to be constructive, and those Arab countries that normalize ties with Israel would really care about this conflict to include it in future negotiations. So that's where I'm on it.
Thank you, Shira. And Hussein, your thoughts?
Okay, well, let me just respond to Shira, who I thought gave a really interesting set of responses to this question. First of all, I'm not so sure that these were all agreements mainly with the United States. I think the key one, the one between Israel and the UAE, was largely really a bilateral agreement between Israel and the UAE. The UAE is very excited about its partnership with Israel, which it sees eye to eye with in lots of ways. They agree, of course, on Iran, but also on Turkey as a regional threat and an ideological problem. They also, I think the UAE sees itself as a tech hub and as a as a very cutting edge country technically in the region, and they look for regional partners, right? And the only country that's doing the same kind of things and does it better and is a generation, or at least half a generation, maybe a generation and a half ahead of the UAE, is Israel. There's no one else to partner with in the area. So they're very, very keen on the Israelis for reasons that have nothing to do with the United States. Then it is true they wanted the F-35s, which they're going to get. They wanted to repair relations with Democrats. They wanted to please Trump. There are many, many, many reasons that they wanted to do. And I think also with Bahrain, it's not really about the United States. For Bahrain, Bahrain is driven primarily by fear of Iran. Iran, under the Shah and the Islamic Republic, has a complete territorial claim on Bahrain, right? Mainly it was under the Shah. He revoked it, but even officials in the Islamic Republic have reiterated this from the point of view of the Bahraini regime. They feel they're under a suspended death sentence, and not from the Islamic Republic, but from Iran tout court, right? Iran, regardless of the government. Who's doing the heavy lifting against Iran, especially Iran's proxies in the region? It's Israel, and in Syria, in Iraq, and potentially in Lebanon. So for Bahrain, getting closer to the Israelis is a no-brainer, and especially since it doesn't bother the Americans at all. Now, when you bring in Sudan and Morocco, it's really much more about negotiations with Washington, using leverage, using Israel's leverage with Washington. right? In the case of Sudan, it was money and getting off the terrorism list. In the case of Morocco, it's all about Western Sahara. An article in Bloomberg about that today. You can't write about Morocco, Western Sahara, and the United States without refracting it through an Israeli lens, both in terms of the occupation and settlement and annexation angle, and also why did Trump do this? Why did he suddenly get interested in Western Sahara, a place he probably never heard of otherwise? It's because of Israel. So for Morocco and Sudan, I think that really is true. I think it's a lot less true of the UAE and Bahrain, but it's complicated. The Palestinian reaction, I want to come to this. So my feeling is that honestly, this set of normalizations, there is no direct path towards leveraging these normalizations to aid the cause of a two-state solution. It's going to be, if it works, it's going to be very indirect, because it de-incentivizes Israel to make concessions to the Palestinians. I mean, that's just a fact. This for the Palestinians is a disaster, and it's a disaster largely of their own making, right? They have for the past, almost decade, as a national strategy, have basically had the Arab Peace Initiative, which is the idea that the Arab states as a bloc would provide an incentive for the Israelis to come to terms with the Palestinians and add peace with the Arab states and then maybe with the Muslim states as well as a kind of sweetener at the end of the process. And, obviously with the UAE agreement and then these others, that linkage is broken. First of all, there is no united Arab bloc. Secondly, the linkage between normalization and occupation is shattered, right? And it only becomes it becomes normalization for non-annexation, which is merely not taking a major step in the wrong direction. It doesn't even preclude new settlement activities like, the expanding Har Homa and things like that. So it's really very limited in its uses for Palestinians, and it kind of shatters their. They were sort of playing a game, the Palestinian leadership. They really didn't have a national strategy, so they used the Arab Peace Initiative as a substitute for national strategy. But of course, when your national strategy is going to be implemented and defined by somebody else, they could decide for their own reasons to reinterpret it or ditch it or change it, without considering its impact on you. And that's exactly what happened. So I think maybe the way in which this is going to work to the advantage of the peace process is force the Palestinians to come up with a national strategy to deal with Israel for the first time in a decade. They just haven't had one. And now that's exposed. It's completely exposed. The thing they used to pretend it was a strategy is no longer viable. So the first reaction was to pretend to want to have an election, which I told everyone from day one would definitely not happen. And it certainly is not going to. And you'll see all kinds of other excuses for or substitutes for national policy. And the reason for this is they don't have a national leadership, right? The Fatah is a mayorship of an archipelago of West Bank cities. And Abu Mazen thinks of himself, Abbas thinks of himself as the president of the Palestinians, but he calculates like the mayor of Ramallah. And the same applies to Hamas in Gaza. They don't calculate on a national basis. They calculate on preserving their little emirate in Gaza and trying to sneak back into the West Bank. Under such circumstances, it's very hard to have a national policy. And in fact, they don't have one. So if this can kickstart a process whereby Palestinians face the reality that they are dealing with Israel one-on-one, that there is no regional dimension to this, that there is no Arab bloc to save them, there is nothing to save them, that they just have to negotiate a deal with the Israelis, that will be very good. One final thing. Normalization is good. We want states in the region to have normal relations. It's a given. It's a good thing by definition. But Palestinians are afraid of normalization because they don't want the reality of Israel to be normalized and the reality of the occupation. especially to be normalized. Fine. I think, as I have argued a week ago, that they can really use the normalization here as a leverage by saying, right, you states, Arab and Israeli, want normalcy, want normal relations. You want to normalize normal. You want to be normal. That's great. We want to be normal too. We want normalcy, and there's, the great thing about normalcy is it could be realized in a single state, in two states, in a confederation, in all kinds of different ways. But I think everyone in the world knows what normalcy means for individual human beings, right? And the Palestinian situation in the occupied territories is not that. So I'll stop with that.
Karen, can I comment just for quick?
Yes, of course.
Sorry. So Hussein, I didn't mean that the UAE and maybe in Bahrain, also Israeli normalization and what has emerged as even warmer ties than we had anticipated is not genuine. And there are not other reasons for doing, including convergence of interests on regional threats and a shared interest in being tech hubs and economic opportunities. But the timing of when that happened had to do with the sweetness of the Trump administration. We know you had the back channels existed for years. There were 300 to 500 Israeli tech companies operating in the UAE through intermediaries before. So, I mean, and it's not a bad thing, but I actually give all kudos to the UAE for being really brave. They took a risk. They didn't know they would not get pushed back. They didn't know that the Arab League would not condemn them. So in a sense, it turned out to be really good. But at the time, like the push for that to happen, at the moment that happened, it had to do with investment from the Trump administration.
I think they saw an opportunity to rationalize what they wanted to do. I knew 2 years before that they had decided to look for a way to normalize with Israel. I could have told you that 2 years before they did it, or at least, 2 years. I think when the whole issue of annexation became a real problem for Netanyahu, running on it on the election, and he didn't want to do it. For Trump, he wanted it to be a second term question, not a first term question. I think this was a real opportunity for the UAE to say, right, if we come in and do this agreement on the basis that because of us, you don't annex, and that way we can also claim to be saving the Arab Peace Initiative, right? This is in a proof of concept. This isn't destroying the Arab Peace Initiative, at least from the point of view of the Arab states. It's proof of concept. And we are keeping the two-state solution alive by preventing annexation. This was, I think, the opportunity they suddenly saw. Yeah, it definitely had to do with Trump. You're not wrong. But don't forget that opportunity. I think both Netanyahu and Trump were in a fix, and they saw an opportunity to do themselves a favor and help these potential partners.
Right, 100%, but it's all on the UAE for seizing the opportunity. There were many other voices against annexation, but they were the ones smart enough to provide the latter.
That's right.
Just two other quick points to what you said. I and many other analysts, right, we always said that the incentive for Israel would be normalization with 22 Arab states and all in total 57 Arab and Muslim states. But you know what? Looking back now, and you're saying now this incentive was withdrawn, but let's say that all this time when the incentive was hanging, Israel did not move an inch toward advancing peace. Right. So now I'm questioning, all of us, we all assumed, we all said it, and it didn't incentivize. And my hope is that it would not disincentivize. The first few months, of course, 100%, and the Palestinians respond in a way that's really shot themselves in the foot. But I hope in the long run, maybe some positive could come out of it. And that brings me to just the last thing you said. I 100% agree on the no national strategy, no leadership, a failure of leadership on the Palestinian point, which goes way beyond its ties with the Arab world. It goes to, this whole election saga just demonstrates
everything.
But it's not just that. It's economics. It's other things, right?
It's everything.
as I was looking into the numbers, because at RAND, we like tried to look at the numbers and said, okay, Israel and the UAE start trading. So let's bring the Palestinians to trade. So then you look at it, it's like, what do Palestinians produce? And what export markets do they have? And the Palestinians exported between 2017 and 2019, $30 million worth of goods to the UAE. It's nothing. It's nothing. Sorry, Karen, we're like having our own conversation. But then it's very difficult to think of these big strategic ideas when you come down to the facts. How do you actually do it? And that's why I think we need to start from small success stories.
Yeah, for sure.
Show tangible benefits.
No, well, I mean, I agree with that. Just
That's
because
fair,
that's the only thing that's doable. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, I think we're touching on a lot of various points of this conversation. I think it would be first and foremost great to hear from the audience what they think. So I believe Dalia just sent around a link. We're going to ask you to answer the poll with similar questions. And the polling question is really about whether you agree or disagree with some of the statements. So please do click on the link. And once we get a critical mass of responses, we'll share them here. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts. But as you do answer those questions, I do want to continue this really engaging conversation while incorporating some questions we're getting. So we spoke a lot about the Palestinians and leadership. So actually, I'm just going to go to this question and ask, the Palestinian leadership has been virtually unanimous in their condemnation of the Abraham Accords, which they have rebuked as a betrayal of the Palestinian cause on behalf of the Arab states, as you all just noted. So do you think this characterization is justified, and what can be done to ensure that future normalization agreements don't alienate Palestinians? And I'll turn it over to you, Hussein.
I mean, it's just from a Palestinian point of view, it's justified in the sense that they expected Arab states to behave differently, and they were led to believe they would, at least in public, right? And they were counting on the Arab states not to do this, to at least, if not to follow through on the promise of the Arab Peace Initiative, at least not to break the illusion, right? Because this exposes the lack of a national strategy, which then, if you think about it, exposes the lack of a national leadership. And it really does sort of show how bare the Palestinian cupboard really is at this point. And that's very awkward for someone like Mahmoud Abbas. And it's even awkward for Hamas, even though they're kind of outside the leadership, but they're not completely. And so they have this weird relationship with the PLO, and which they're not part of, but they're critical of it. But then they want they don't question its authority. They want to take it over, but they can't figure out how. And it's this whole complicated thing. So ultimately, you can certainly understand why Palestinians would regard this as a betrayal. From the point of view of Gulf countries, the UAE and Bahrain, of course, is not a betrayal in the sense that this is their national interest. They're acting for themselves, not for anybody else. They're putting themselves first. They're not doing anything unusual or unreasonable. They're establishing diplomatic relations with a country which the Palestinians have recognized too. In 1993, the PLO recognized Israel. So, and they deal with it all the time. So in that sense, the Palestinian request them seems a little weird. And if you look at the interview that Prince Bandar gave to Al Arabiya, the Saudi owned TV station, a few months ago. I mean, he's very blunt in giving the Gulf grievances towards the Palestinians, where it basically says, you guys are morally right and the Israelis are morally wrong, but they have an effective leadership and you don't. We have our own national interests, and we've put ourselves on the line for you time and again. From their point of view, Palestinians wouldn't agree with that, but that's how they see it. And you never take our interests into consideration when you decide what to do. So at a certain point, we're done, for prioritizing you. Now, a Palestinian would say you never prioritize us, and you've always abused our issue and taken advantage, and this is all a plot and whatnot. But it can get a little pathological. It can become a bit paranoid when you expect other people to behave against their own interests. It's a little strange. I think it's a matter of perspective on the justification. I think Palestinians can be expected to feel betrayed but I think it only looks like a betrayal from their point of view. I think from a Gulf point of view and even a neutral point of view, it doesn't look much like a betrayal. It looks like busting their, the leadership level, busting their routine and really exposing them in a very nasty way. And so that, I think, is really what drives a lot of the extreme anger at the leadership level.
Thank you, Hussein. And Shira, do you have anything to add?
Well, I'll just say that I think the Palestinian response to the first country, right, the normalization, when the UAE announced it, was really, I mean, so childish, and flags were burned, and they returned their ambassador and had issued all these threats. But that also was built on really very difficult, intense relations between the Palestinian leadership and the Abu Dhabi, the Emirates for quite a few years before. You notice that when Morocco announced, and with Morocco it's a different type because they already had ties with Israel and sort of restoration, but there was no such response. And it's because there are different ties with Morocco, exactly, and there are different relations with Morocco, and Morocco has a very important place also in Jerusalem, and ties are very, very different. So first of all, I think Palestinians learned that this was their the initial response was really counterproductive for their own sake, but also these things, they come with their own issues, right? Not all countries the same. The PA has different relationship with each country, with Qatar, with Saudis and stuff. I will tell you that what I'm hearing now, and this is, it goes to the failure of leadership, the fact that really this defunct group of old men that run this thing, the territory in the West Bank, with very limited sovereignty, because we have to admit it, they're under occupation. So I want to put it, we have to put it like there. They don't have ideal conditions to run their people, their entity. But there are calls within the PA and some practitioners and some young politicians that are saying, listen, we have to be different. It's a matter of time. Everyone's going to normalize ties with Israel. And we don't want to hear about it from the paper like we did about the UAE. We want to make sure we're included. Now, this doesn't solve the bigger issue that Hussein spoke about, that they need to have a national strategy that includes a component that's bilateral vis-a-vis Israel. But that, in their mind now, has failed. So at least in the regional one, they're saying, make sure we're included, and we will do something. Whether this materializes or not, I hope so, but I think they understand that failure in the Arab League and not getting any condemnation, and you have Egypt and Jordan and everyone else, it's like they're on their own, in that regard, they're on their own, and I think they know it now.
It's really in their interest to face the fact that this is now a localized problem, that it is an argument between a very powerful group of about 7 million Jewish Israelis and a very unpowerful group of about 7 million Palestinians. And that's the reality. And it's going to be hashed out between those people with all the asymmetry that exists. And that's the way it is. And pretending it's something else is not helpful to them.
Right. But I will say, because I think there's a sense also definitely in Israel and other parts, we normalize ties, the strongest, definitely a regional power, probably the strongest regional power, right? You would argue middle power on many different other things, the technology and stuff. But, we say the Palestinians are all alone, and I think they are. But in terms of Israel's position with the Palestinians, Israel is also all alone.
Big time.
The Arab countries don't care. I mean, even those that say they care, they don't care because they have other interests.
I don't care.
They don't care. The US has other priorities, right? So some people care, but they definitely have other priorities. And then Europeans are already also fed up, and they can't keep bankrolling this thing. And, at the end of the day, as someone who now lives in Tel Aviv, I will tell you, the Palestinians are not going anywhere. So Israel can feel as powerful as it wants now and complain about the Palestinians and say that they're lost. But at the end of the day,
I mean, over time, this will isolate Israel in many pockets in the international community in the West where they have been welcomed since 1948. Increasingly, if this is the reality and it's going to be codified and systematized, there are big chunks of the West who are going to have a very negative reaction to this. It's very hard to know how far it will go.
There's also violence
Yeah.
No, there have been very quiet years, but this all hinges on Palestinian collaboration with being occupied.
Of course.
And you can't bank on it forever, and it's
To the
not right
contrary.
anymore. It's morally very wrong, but you know, you can't talk about rights here. So if you want to talk about like what's in Israel's interest, Jerusalem is on fire. I just got announced that the Czech Shira, again, you have protests, you have fire from Gaza, you have more terrorism attempts in the West Bank. I mean, it hurts Israel at the end of the day, even if Israelis don't want to talk about rights, which I think is important. It's an important conversation.
Thank you both. And I think what I'm hearing is Palestinians are increasingly isolated and Israel's increasingly isolated, and the trend is moving towards normalization, but we're all kind of alone here. But I think one of the actors that we're missing from the conversation so far is the United States. I mean, the Trump administration gave a lot of incentives towards normalization, as you guys already covered. And now we have a new administration, the Biden administration, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how their policy towards normalization may change or not. And just building on some of the comments you made, Ambassador Martin Indyk in the first round of these series said, the United States is the only partner, a third party that can really bring the two to the table. Do you agree that the US still has a role to play here, or has it lost its credibility? Lots of questions there, but I will turn to you, Shira, to answer first.
Sure. So I'll start with the first one. I think the United States is still the most important one because it's the only one that actually brings, the whole gravitas, and it's the only one that Israel trusts. But the United States doesn't have to work alone. There's a body, it's called the Quartet, which would let the US not do it alone, share the burden, but they can still lead. You have a very active UN on that, and they're probably the most equipped to deal with it at the moment. You have the Europeans, you have the Russians. This is also an area where Russia and the US can have some partnership if all parties wanted to do this, but only the United States, I think, can move this seriously if they really want it. So the US is still needed in my opinion, especially for the Israeli side. And I think the Palestinians also with the Biden administration, they also understand that their approach to the US under Trump, even though Trump did everything in his power to weaken the Palestinians and hurt them, it was also counterproductive on their part. Well, it's still early to say. The Biden administration has been in office a little over 100 years, right? But judging based on their appointments of the people in dealing with the Middle East, Barbara Leaf, Brett McGurk, they're not people that know this part of the world. There's the Gulf, they know Iraq, and Syria. Brett. You have Hadi Amar, who's great. He's a deputy assistant secretary, but his background is in economics. Yeah. They didn't appoint, there's no ambassador yet. There's all this middle level is not there. They're talking about and what we're saying, what we know that they want to do is sort of fix some of the damage that Trump did to relationships between the United States and the Palestinian people. They want to have relationships that are independent and not go through Israel. So they're saying, well, let's reopen the consulate to the Palestinians that Trump closed. Let's restore aid to the Palestinians. And there are different other things that they're doing. But on the normalization itself, I mean, the President Biden and I think everyone in his administration agreed that normalization is a very good thing. And I think they would come on board if the opportunity presents itself. We don't see any evidence now that they're going to be proactive about it, like the Trump administration. And I think they're going to make a point of not offering any sweeteners. So it doesn't look transactional. So, and you might need those, you may need a US incentive. And plus, and I let Hussein speak about this, because Saudi is such a big player for both Israelis and Palestinians, but Saudi is in such a bad place now in Washington, and this is a bipartisan position, it'll be very hard for the US to bring Saudi out of the fold for an Israeli statement, recommitment to two-state solution. So I think it's going to be very challenging for them and not a priority.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. The US look, the US is the only actor internationally that can play this role and that wants to play this role. It's not like there's a long line of competitors saying, let us do it, let us. And the only other country that's shown any interest in playing such a role is France. Not even the whole EU, just France alone. And they can't, they don't have the heft. And they don't have, so it's pretty much the US or nothing. And I think the US is better than nothing. So, and it's still an American interest. So I think it's going to continue. Look, I think the analysis that Shira gave of where the Biden administration is exactly right. I think they're going to work very hard to get back to the status quo that Trump inherited from second term Obama, which was a disastrous one, but he managed to make it a lot worse. So they want to, restore relations with the Palestinians. But there are some things that can't be done, like reopening the PLO mission in Washington right now, given the legislation, the Taylor Force Act and other things that would expose the PLO to major liabilities in court cases, and they don't want that. So, a lot of damage has been done. Some of it's reversible, some of it's not. And at the end of the day, the biggest lift they want to do is go back to a really bad situation, but one that isn't quite as bad as the one Trump produced. It's not very ambitious, but if I were in the administration, I would not be urging them to be particularly that much more ambitious at this stage, because I don't think there's that much to work with on either side. I mean, I would talk, as Shira said, about doing a lot of little things on the ground, and doing a lot of prep work and building, and pressuring both sides not to make matters worse. I think clearly letting the Israelis go forward in Har Homa and Sheikh Jarrah and places like that is absolutely crazy. So you got to stop that. While you're rebuilding relations with Palestinians, the worst excesses of the settler movement have to be restrained, or the whole thing is going to get even more out of hand. But other than that, it's really a long-term process, right? So what I agree also about normalization. I don't think the Saudis want to make this decision right now. And if they can avoid making it, they will. What the administration wants much more is an end to the war in Yemen. That's what the Saudis want to give them. The Houthis don't want to let the Saudis go. They've got them by the toe, and they've got no incentive to let them leave. So this, I think, is the big ask of the Saudis. They made a lot of progress with the administration. They ended the Qatar boycott. They released Lujend Hatlal and a bunch of other prisoners. They, the Khashoggi matter was put on the table. The facts were put out there, et cetera. I think Biden tried to put that behind the United States with some success, but there's still lingering anger among many Democrats and some internationalist Republicans, but a lot less. And I think it's clear that a lot of progress has been made. Something more is needed, but I think both Washington and Riyadh would rather have it happen in Yemen than with regard to Israel. Yes, if there's an opportunity to go forward, sure, the administration will take it. And they're not going to ruin things by withholding the F-35s from the UAE. I said from the beginning, they're going to get these weapons. I mean, no question. It's going to take 6 or 7 years to create a model just for them and give it and all that. But eventually they'll get it. They're not going to put Sudan back on the terrorism list that Sudan has no business being on in the first place. They should have been taken off immediately. There was a revolution in Sudan on its own merits. It shouldn't have been part of a negotiation at all, but it was. The interesting thing is in Western Sahara, right? Morocco has not agreed to, in spite of what the Trump administration said, Morocco has not committed to a full restoration of diplomatic relations with Israel. They committed to a re-engagement with diplomatic relations with Israel. During the heyday of the Oslo process, they established a liaison office in Rabat for Israel and for Morocco in Tel Aviv. And those were closed in 2000 at the height of the violence of the Second Intifada. The way the Israeli trade mission in Doha was closed also. I mean, there was a lot of diplomatic relations that were sub-ambassadorial level, sub-embassy level, but real, in the Arab world, that Israel lost in 2000 because of the violence of the Second Intifada. The Moroccans agreed to restore those offices, and they have restored them, but not to go further because what they wanted was an American recognition of Moroccan sovereignty in Western Sahara. It's very analogous to Israel's claims in the West Bank, right? It's a territory, it was seized by war, there's a lot of settlers there, and it's an annexation in defiance of the United Nations and in defiance of the, the Fourth Geneva Convention and what have you. Okay, lots of parallels. Probably closer than Cyprus, the closest thing to the West Bank that you find anywhere else, right? Trump doesn't care about the UN Charter and international law and Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, paragraph 7. He hasn't heard of these things, couldn't care less about them. Biden's position is torn. On the one hand, he's for normalization, because it's exactly what Democrats want US allies to do, to normalize. And they want, if there is a guiding principle for the Biden administration at home and abroad, it's a return to regular order, right? Regular order, that's what they're fascinated with that. So normalization is regular order on steroids, right? But if you have to facilitate that by breaking the most basic aspect of the UN Charter, which is the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war, the main thing that prevents international relations from being a law of the jungle and might making right. And if countries can just seize territory, like Russia, what are you going to say to Russia in Crimea? Why can't they have Crimea? Well, the UN Charter. Well, other than that, so it's already, there's a problem with the Golan Heights in East Jerusalem. In this case, the Moroccans did not take Trump's tweet. It was a tweet recognizing Moroccan sovereignty in Western Sahara as fixed US policy. They only agreed to reopen the liaison offices because while they were very happy with it, they wanted to know, before they go further, they want to hear that this is a transferable policy change from Democrats to Republicans, and that this is fixed. And they're waiting to hear that from the Biden administration, and they're not hearing it. Instead, the Polisario Front and the Algerians are all happy that it's not being reiterated. The Moroccans are getting more and more nervous about what they're seeing. And basically, Biden is kicking the can down the road. He's not making a decision. So his enthusiasm for sweetening these normalizations with extraordinary gestures, like recognition of annexation of occupied territory, not in the West Bank, but on the other side of Africa, is not there right now. What in the end they do about that, I don't know. They might just never do anything and leave it as is.
Awesome, thank you both. I have one more question before we turn to the Mentimeter results and audience Q&A. And just briefly want to hear from you all with these new diplomatic relations that are happening. Does that signifies a growing acceptance of Israel in the region politically and economically, but do they also reflect or signify a similar sense of acceptance of Israel and Israelis at the civilian level? Hussein, your thoughts first.
Well, I think in some places, yes, and in some places, no. In the UAE and Bahrain, especially in the UAE peace and partnership, budding partnership with Israel, is the breakthrough in the Arab world that Israelis have been waiting for since 1948. More that because the peace with Egypt has been cold and distant. And even though relations are probably at a government level are better today than they have been since the death of Sadat between Egypt and Israel, but still there's no enthusiasm in Egyptian civil society and even in much of the government for Israel. Jordan, yes, it's a better relationship, but Jordan is not a hub. And even in Jordan, there's a lot of tension. In the UAE, and particularly Abu Dhabi and Dubai, these two city-states, are the first places in the Arab world which are eager to embrace Jewish Israelis as friends and at the people-to-people level. And they are also hubs for Arabs in the whole region. So this is the first opportunity for ordinary Israelis to go and meet the Arabs on friendly terms in an Arab country en masse and be very welcome. And I think that's a potential game changer in Arab-Israeli relations in the long run, because Abu Dhabi and Dubai are now places where ordinary Arabs can meet ordinary Israelis without leaving the region, right? In a friendly person-to-person basis, without an occupation, without a cold peace, without a legacy of wars, that anger people. UAE was not part of that. I think it's the long-term impact of this should be very positive, and it could be very positive, and it bears watching really carefully.
Share your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I agree 100% with Hussein. I think it's really interesting, I think from Israeli friends that have, been traveling to the Gulf for years, they really report a change. I always go with the US passport, so this doesn't matter, but they always report a change. They report a change that they said that previously they would be like going in and meeting secretly. And a day after the normalization, even government officials, but also just like business people would like parade them in restaurants and introduce them to everyone. It's like it's a source of pride now. And I think it's really, really important. This is something that I think I appreciate in the actual wording of the Abraham Accords themselves, that they say that they are recognizing the Arab and Jewish peoples are descendants of a common ancestor, Abraham, and inspired that spirit to foster a Middle Eastern reality of coexistence. So it's really something that's very, very deep, and something that's very, very missing from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because the whole narrative of the Palestinians is that Israel is Zionism is a colonial movement, right? That really has no right here. It came from Europe.
They pathologize each other, yeah.
And I think this is something that really should be a framing principle. And by the way, also for Israelis, I mean, growing up here in this country, I will tell you, we were taught in the textbooks that, this was a land with no people for peoples without a land, with no land. So this was also a very wrong thing. Just on Jordan and Egypt, I think I agree with Hussein, but I think we even have to correct. Ties with Egypt are even not that good on the government level. What they're good is at the military level.
Okay.
Between the militaries, they're very good security. And with Jordan, it's exactly the same. It's just military to military. The relationship between the king and Netanyahu.
Yeah.
I mean,
there's a lot of tension between Israel and Jordan.
Awful. And
I really had the security thing in mind with Egypt. I think you're right.
And with Jordan also, the military to military ties are very important. The military establishment in Israel understands the importance of Jordan. The government, Netanyahu, what's happening with the king, with the family, it's really disturbing.
Right.
And I think it trickles down to the people, because there's the anti-Israel sentiment in those countries, even though they've had peace for a long time with Israel, it's pretty high. And
the Jordanians fear that the Israelis are trying to transfer authority over the holy places in East Jerusalem to dangle this in front of the Saudis. Saudis don't seem to be interested. I don't know the extent to which Israeli officials have been proposing transferring this thing that is in the peace agreement, but it's a real fear in Jordan. Annexation was considered an existential threat to Jordan, right? They were the biggest winners of the Abraham Accords, and other than the three signatory countries, the US, UAE, and Israel, the big winner was Jordan. So they're not happy with the Israelis at all, with Netanyahu at all.
Right.
On
100%. And I will tell you, the Jordanians know, and they know very well, and I will give a plug to a study that we did for IPF looking at alternatives to the two-state solution. And we include the Jordanian option there, basically that Jordan is Palestine. And it's not because it's our idea. It's because the Jordanians know that there are Israeli officials in the current Israeli government and in Knesset that see this is the real homeland for the Palestinians. Right. Jordan would collapse and the Palestinians will take over. And that is something that those Israelis think would not be a bad thing.
Yeah.
So the Jordanians are scared for a reason.
Of course.
I think it's very interesting that you guys point out that the UAE's response, civilian response to Israelis is so different. I mean, when we saw the gas deals and energy deals between Egypt and Jordan and Israel, it was a completely different response from civilians. I mean, there were protests across Jordan over these agreements. So very, very interesting. As you said, maybe a starting point for normalization. I want to turn over to the polling results. And Dalia, if you can post it up on the screen, and maybe we can react a little bit to the response. So as you all see here, we asked the audience to indicate the extent to which they agree or disagree with the following statements. General moderate agreement that the Abraham Accords signify that much of the Arab world is ready to accept Israel and even embrace it as a partner, and that the Israeli-Arab conflict is over. And then the second one, where there's a little bit more agreement, expanding Israel's regional integration serves to benefit both Palestinians and Israelis, including Arab citizens of Israel. And third, overall, the Abraham Accords has minimal impact on the state of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's pretty much, folks don't agree with that. So what are your reactions, Shira, to these answers? What do you think?
I have to. I think, it's very difficult to, I think it's too early to answer with certainty. What would be the right answer? I'm with the participant in the hope that 2 is the one, right? I just don't know that it would just happen organically, or maybe we should say it's a short-term and long-term thing. In the short term, it's hard for me to see how it serves both Israelis and Palestinians, unless we're talking about what Hussein spoke about before, which is a wake-up call for the Palestinians to develop a strategy, that understanding the time is not necessarily on their side. So it's more like with tough love, getting the message. It's hard for me to see this materializing into something that's beneficial for both, definitely for Israel, but not for Palestinians in the short term, but hopefully yes in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see it as love of any kind, but tough. It's certainly tough. All right, so yeah, I mean, I think what's most important is that on question 2, it's too early to tell, right? I think there's a definite potential for Palestinian citizens of Israel to benefit from this opening. There's this initial impulse in the UAE to want to deal with Jewish Israelis, to go to the center of power in Israel and all that stuff. I think over time, and there'll be openings. There is a honeymoon right now between the Israelis and the Emiratis, and that's not going to last. There's going to become a desengaño at some point. People are going to realize that all their greatest wishes are not being fulfilled, and they can't be. And at that point, I think there's a real opening for the Palestinian citizens of Israel to pick up some of the slack. So we'll see. As for the Palestinians in the occupied territories, I think it's, it could go either way. And at this point, I do think the Abraham Accord has had a minimal impact on the state of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the main impact is to reveal the underlying reality, which is that this has been for a long time a local conflict without much regional and international. It has a lot of regional and international significance, but not a lot of regional and international engagement in the sense of determining the outcome either way. It's between these two groups, and that I think was as true a year ago as it is today, but I think it's more obvious today. But I don't think it's changed anything fundamental.
Thanks, both. I think I would agree with that as well.
I agree with that also, but just so we're not agreeing on everything, and it's not boring, I'll just say, no, it is a local conflict, and it's an ethnic conflict, and it's a conflict between two peoples. There's a narrative issue, and it's here, and it's very domestic, and it's also confined to a very small area.
Yeah.
But there's a very strong international component, and that's in the funding level. It's mostly the Europeans now, because the US has not been involved in funding Palestinians for 4 years almost. If the Europeans were not bankrolling the Palestinian Authority, and there was not so much aid going to Gaza, and I will say this because let that sink in first, 80% of Palestinians receive some form of international aid, 80%. It would have never been this would not be sustainable. Idea of an independent Palestinian Authority that's supposed to be a state one day, but there's international funding that's supporting it. Israel would have had to provide education services And Israel doesn't want to pay for education and health of, what are we talking about? 6 million Palestinians?
Yes.
No way.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that. You can say all of this enables the occupation to continue, but there are, of course, there are other ways of keeping territory without keeping people. You can throw people off their land. That's happened at least twice in the recent history of this conflict on a fairly large scale. And I think we've exited a world in which that's not thinkable anymore. I think we're now back in a world where that's thinkable again. Frankly,
Yes.
and I think one of the biggest lessons Palestinians need to learn, along with embracing normalcy as an answer to normalization, is whatever you do, the biggest threat to you is your own violence. Because if you were to give into widespread violence, it would give annexationists in Israel a potential excuse to get you out under the cover of chaos. It's been done twice before. There's no reason it can't be done again. 10 years ago, we were in an international environment where I don't think that was possible. But yeah, in the current one, why not?
Yeah.
Really, who's going to do anything about it? So what must be done? I think Palestinians have to be extremely careful not to provide that excuse in the West Bank. Extremely careful, or I think the chances of it happening are, greater than 50%. And that's a grim thing to say, but I think it is. And I also think the idea that the Israeli army wouldn't carry out such orders is now fanciful. There may have been a time where there was enough of a sensibility, but that's clearly not the Israeli army that exists now.
No. And I think it's not even, you look at it, on the one hand, the use of force, you could argue that's only this equation that you portrayed is true, but it's mostly true in the West Bank, right? Because
yes.
in Gaza, Israel basically facilitates the payment of, I don't have a better term for it, protection for Hamas,
yes.
right? So they fire a few rockets and Israel pays them and facilitates those suitcases of cash from Qatar.
Yes.
They don't drive themselves, those suitcases, let's say, but it's but in terms of the fire instructions for soldiers, we saw this with the March of Return demonstrations in Gaza. There was much more heavy use of force than we anticipated, and this was Gadi Eisenkot, who was the chief of staff, who is not a trigger happy person.
Yeah, he's not an extremist, and yet it happened, right? So I agree with you. I think these things take on a logic of their own. You don't have to go into this situation with that intention in order to end up being the one who actually does it. And once it happens, there's no reversing. There's no people leaving and coming back. That does not happen. Almost all the Palestinians who fled or were expelled in 47, 48 left thinking they were coming home in a few weeks. It didn't occur to them that people don't go back to their homes. Whoever wins, that's about who rules. But the idea that we don't go home is not in their frame of reference. It certainly needs to be now.
Sorry, Karen,
it's all right. It's okay. So actually, your comments are a perfect way to segue. We're going to open it up to the questions, and there's quite a few. So I'll try to merge some here and there. But one of the questions you mentioned, Gazi, you mentioned Qatar, is what do Israel's relations with Qatar look like at the moment, particularly in the wake of the Abraham Accords and the end of the GCC crisis in the past year? How do Qataris envision their role in the conflict going forward, particularly in Gaza? Either one of you, whoever wants to take it.
Oh, I'll be happy to talk about that. All right. So Qatar, I think it's really important to note that in the Gulf, before last summer, before the Abraham Accords, the UAE normalization agreement, the highest point Israel's diplomatic relations in the Gulf had ever reached was in Qatar with the Israeli trade mission in Doha that existed between 98 and 2000, or was it 97 and 2000? I think it was 98 and 2000. But anyway, it was closed again, like the liaison office with Morocco in the context of the violence of the Second Intifada. But I think it's very clear that Qatar, at least at that point, in its general drive to be friendly to everybody and to be a mediator and whatnot, was very keen on developing relations with the Israelis. And I think there's a part of the Qatari mentality that is very frustrated that it was the UAE and not Qatar that took the plunge with the Israelis. On the other hand, Qatar's regional profile has changed somewhat. With or without the boycott, Qatar has become much more joined at the hip to Turkey in a vertically integrated Sunni Islamist alliance led by Turkey, with Qatar as much more clearly the junior partner. And so their dependency on Turkey grew during the boycott, but also their ideological merger, well, not merger, but their ideological affiliation with Turkey has grown independently since the late 90s, reinforced by the boycott. I think their space, therefore, as long as the boycott was there, there was also a need to placate Iran, because they were dependent on Iran, not just for access to the oil field that they rely on for their income, but also for overflight rights that they were paying the Iranians for. They couldn't use Saudi airspace, Emirati airspace, so they had to go over Iran. They had to pay them money, etc. That's over, right? So they still have to have working relations with Iran, but they don't have to tread as carefully. They do have to tread very carefully with the Turks. I don't think right now their international position has really dug into the Brotherhood movement, really dug into the partnership with Turkey, gives them the bandwidth under current circumstances to open up to the Israelis. But I think they're ready to do it as soon as the regional environment allows for it, because I think that idea that they want to be friends with everybody is still there in the Qatari mentality. They're kind of Janus-based in a way.
Yeah, I'll just add to that I think what Hussein said is exactly correct, but with if you may know that the last round of hostilities between Israel and Hamas was in 2014, but since then every summer we've been anticipating escalation. In 2018 we were like this on the verge of another war, and really Qatar came to the rescue, and the idea was that they would help provide funding to calm the situation down in Gaza, humanitarian support. It was in the form of, yeah, it was like for poor families, 100,000 poor families, and those were really poor families. The numbers were submitted, but also, and this is something we have to talk about, there's a lot of like capacity building money that goes directly to Hamas. All of the workers of the Qatari embassy or consulate building in Gaza are all Hamas employees. And Israel uses it, Israel benefits from it. I mentioned the suitcases, you know, at the beginning they would have actually come through Ben Gurion airport, suitcases with dollars, but in Gaza they use shekels. So who do you think would convert those? And those suitcases, someone had to drive them to Gaza. And this is money that goes directly to Hamas. But it also really helped Qatar, I think, because at the time, the rift in the Gulf, again, one of the brainchilds, I think, of Saudi adventurism, right? It's like, well, let's try to boycott Qatar. Let's try to strangle it. So also they were dependent on Turkey for imports. It's a landlocked country. They had to trust someone. But at the same time, you know, when Qatar came to the aid of Gaza and Israel could tell Kushner or whoever, well, we know you have their issues with Qatar because your friends in the Gulf tell you, but they really help us with Gaza. So it really benefited Qatar also. And it would be interesting to see how long this lasts. You know, the Qatari envoy to Gaza, Imadi, I mean, now it's COVID, but he would hang out at Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv, meets everyone, and there's great appreciation for their efforts here. The irony is that, you know, you do strengthen Hamas. And Hamas, whether you think they're here to stay or not, it's also it's not only, but it's also a terrorist movement. And you don't strengthen in the same way your very defunct, but at least non-violent peace partner.
Right. I mean, look, the Qatari money that you're describing is it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say it's at the request of Israel and the United States. It's at their behest, not just with their permission. They are pleased by it. Washington is happy to give, someone has to transfer money into Gaza so people can eat, because otherwise they don't eat, and that would be an impossible situation. And the Israelis would have to ship in food, and it would be no one else wants to do it. precisely because they will be strengthening Hamas when they do that. So Qatar is the country that can afford it, that's willing to do it, that finds it politically beneficial to strengthen this Muslim Brotherhood movement in Gaza, and that isn't bothered by the idea that there'll be a strengthening Hamas. So it's, everybody wants the Qataris to do this. There's no way the UAE is going to do it. No way. No way.
Although aid to the people of Gaza, I mean, these are European countries that don't speak with Hamas. Aid goes to Gaza to projects.
That's another story. No, but we're talking about paying. Yeah, but we're talking about paying Gaza, employees of Hamas. We're talking about paying the civil servants they hired, their own patronage network, funding their patronage network, right? That's not something that the Norwegians, the donors, or the Arabs, the other Arabs are going to do. Forget it. No way. But sending humanitarian aid, yes, of course.
So, thank you both. That's very enlightening. I wasn't aware of all these different ties. So, I want to get to one more question for the both of you. So I'm going to merge a couple here, but just drawing on some themes that I'm seeing here. So, we talked a bit about Egypt and Jordan and kind of the relations being predominantly security focused and such, but do they have a role to play in terms of, again, relations with Palestinians and a future peacekeeping effort? And in parallel, the UAE here has emerged as the de facto leader of the Abraham Accords Quartet. So far, seems to have prioritized economic and business ties with Israel. Do they have a role to play in terms of encouraging Israel to pursue a two-state solution? I know you both have said it's kind of more of an isolation than it is a promotion of peace, but is there something that these other countries who have important ties with Israel and can do?
You want me to start or Shira?
Sure, whoever wants to start.
I'll start. I mean, look, yes, I think the answer is yes to all those questions. Yes, they have an important role. Egypt has a very important security role when it comes to Gaza, and with regard to both Israel and the Palestinians, Egypt is a significant player, and they can and should play a constructive role. Jordan even more so, right? Jordan on two fronts. Number one, in terms of the fact that the second biggest group of Palestinians, if you exclude the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the biggest group is in the occupied territories. The second biggest group is in Jordan, right? And the Jordanians also, very importantly, are the custodians of the Muslim and Christian holy places in occupied East Jerusalem. This is a very important role, right? So I think the Jordanians really have a very important, very, very important role to play practically and politically in facilitating things. And it's really, I don't understand what the Israeli government thinks is going to happen with Jordan if they go ahead and annex large chunks of the West Bank. I don't know what they expect the Jordanian reaction to be, but it will not be pretty, and it's not something I think that they can really live with. So I think it's very important. As for the UAE, look, right now, and Bahrain, especially the UAE, they're, as I say, they're in a honeymoon with the Israelis, and they're very, very excited. All of them are very excited. Right. But there will come a time sooner rather than later that wears off, and they start to think, well, life is more complicated. This is more complicated. And I think there's a good chance there will come to a point, for whatever set of reasons, that they're going to want to prove that they haven't abandoned the Palestinians. They're going to want to prove that this business about preventing annexation was not just a rationalization, was not an excuse for abandoning the Palestinians to court in order to serve their own interests, right? But that they still do care about a two-state solution because they need a two-state solution, right? It's not like necessarily it has to be altruistic, right? But as long as the Palestinian issue is not resolved, it's a very combustible variable in the region. So I think there is a chance that if Palestinians are patient, right, and look for that opportunity, that they will find a chance to use these new ties to their benefit, and there's nothing they can do to stop it, right? So either you just ignore it completely, or you try to get what you can out of it. Now, the only sensible thing to do is the second thing. You try to, make the best of a bad lemonade, right? It's the classic metaphor. Is you get lemons, you make lemonade. I think they have to look for that opportunity, and I could make fanciful scenarios about how they could do it, or counterfactual ones, but I think the opportunity will come sooner rather than later to try to find that opportunity. It might be kind of limited, it might not go to ending the occupation, but if it's substantial and tangible, you take it.
Shira, what do you think? You have the last word.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with Hussein. I think there are two things. This one is like very, we should differentiate between Jordan and Egypt, they're both really important countries, but they're countries with no money. And so it's hard for them to help with, funding and with aid and with different consortium and story economic activity in businesses, because they need all that stuff themselves. But Egypt, it doesn't have a good PR, I think. And also when you talk about human rights and stuff, it has bad rap in Washington. But I think Egypt can do a better job for itself marketing how important it is at maintaining, this sort of hudna, the ceasefire, the mostly ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Without Egypt, it wouldn't be possible. And Egypt has a really strong role in this. And I think capitalizing on it and inserting its role and how important it is would be very beneficial for Egypt, but also for Israelis and Palestinians. At the same time, when we talk about Jordan should take advantage. It has such a soft spot. The U.S. has such a soft spot for Jordan. And this is sort of across different government agencies. I mean, it's State Department, especially under the Biden administration, but before traditionally, right? Like the Pentagon, it's Jordan, sort of the baby of the Middle East that we have to keep stable. So I think if Jordan comes to the US and says, like, listen, we need the commitment for a two-state solution, because basically the alternative is our collapse, which is what stands on the line. And Jordan should do a lot of, soul searching in how they run their own country. But the Palestinian issue is definitely a threat for them. They can use that. In terms of the other Arab countries that can provide funding, it's both to aid to Gaza, to the Palestinians in general, but I think there's also a U.S. opportunity. In December, Congress passed the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act. It's $250 million in funds to invest in people-to-people activities and business development, economic development of the Palestinian territories. But the idea was always to have it international. It wasn't. Right. It was never supposed to be a U.S. alone act. And I think this is a way for Arab countries with money, by the way, also European countries, to add to that. And people-to-people activities, yeah, they're limited, hard to scale up, but those are definitely needed here on the ground and have completely disappeared. So I think this could be, small, but a very tangible and successful effort that can be promoted with the help of these countries.
I mean, all of that stuff is possible, but I think the U.S. has to take the lead in stopping the parties from making matters worse. If they keep doing crazy things that make matters worse, it's very hard to do the little, cumulative ground building stuff. So,
right.
Violence.
You mentioned powerful the settlement.
Exactly.
An announcement is expected in the next few weeks. So,
yeah. Washington's been blocking that for 25 years. So that we know they can. They have to put their foot down.
Yeah.
Great, thank you both. So in summary of everything I've heard, I think there's small wins that we can achieve in the coming months with these normalizations, especially on the people
right.
level and leveraging some of these normalized ties. Mm-hmm. I'm going to end it with that positive note and say, hopefully the U.S. will play a more constructive role in the coming years under this administration. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dalia, to close us out. Thank you both.
So much, Karen. And thank you, Hussein and Shira. Shira, I know you need to run, so feel free to run. I'll just give some updates before we let you all go this afternoon.
Thank you all. I apologize. I just have another
Of course, yes.
Thank you.
Israel Policy Forum is hiring for our paid one-year IPF Atid National Organizing Fellowship. So recent grads wanting to engage young professionals and advance a two-state solution can apply at ipf.li/fellow. And then if you aren't already following us on social media, you can find us on Instagram at IPF Atid, and you can join our private Facebook group to stay up to date with the latest news in our community and this work. The recording for this event will be shared shortly. That's all I have. So thank you again so much, Hussein and Shira and Karen. This was such a great conversation and really interesting stuff.
Anytime. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank
we
you.
look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you. Have a good day.